Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Transparent Podcast. If you don't know me, I'm your host, Christiana Teddy, and this is the grief episode. If you missed last week's episode, it was our introduction episode. We talked about the goal of the podcast, what we're going to be talking about, the growth, and just the trajectory of the next couple months for the Transparent Podcast. So if you haven't gotten a chance already, I would go and watch that one on my page. It's a really, really good episode, really short episode, but it's really, really good to get a grasp over just what my goal is and why I'm here with you guys. So without further ado, let's get into today's episode. As I said, today is going to be called the grief episode. So I want to start this off by just giving you the definition of grief, the textbook definition. So grief is defined as deep sorrow, especially caused by someone's death or the normal response to a major loss. Now, to me, grief was not a thing that was introduced until recently. I would say the last 6 months were the first time I actually experienced what I thought grief was. Now, since then, I've been taught what grief actually is, and that grief can be more than just the way that I described it or the way that I experienced it. But from what I knew, that's what grief was. So for me, grief was the loss of somebody that died. I've never lost anybody in my life prior to this year. I've never really lost someone that I knew personally. If you know me, you know that I have a twin brother that I lost as a child. But that kind of grief is different, and we're going to get into that, than the grief that I experienced. So about a month and a half ago, in February, let me say, because I couldn't even tell you how long ago it was. In February, my grandmother died, and I was very, very close to my grandmother. She lived with me on and off since COVID. And as a child, I grew up in her house. I grew up visiting her. I grew up constantly just driving to Mississippi with my parents to see her. She'd fly here at literally any drop of the hat. Like if it was Grandparents' Day, she was here. My birthday, she was here. Christmas, she was here. It felt like she was constantly here. And early COVID, she was diagnosed with Alzheimer's, and she progressed pretty quickly. And then my second year in college, she really started to just kind of decrease in her health. And then on February 6th, she passed. And that was the first time I'd ever been struck with real grief. And still am. I honestly could not tell you what that day was like. Like, I honestly have no memory of the rest of that day after finding out my grandmother passed. And that was just so scary because I knew she was gonna pass. I knew things were getting bad. I knew it was coming, but I had no idea that that's what it was gonna feel like. And with my grief came a lot of guilt. I felt like I never really said goodbye to her the way that I should have. The last time I saw her I was home on Christmas break from college. I go to school in Florida, so I was home on Christmas break. And the last time I saw her, I was telling her about AKA, and I remember saying to myself that I wasn't gonna say goodbye because she'd be here when I got back. And I knew the next time I'd be home, originally planned the next time I'd be home was summer. And the next time, it was up in the air whether or not I was gonna see her for my probate, but the next time I knew for sure I'd see her was summer. And I refused to say goodbye because I was sure that she was gonna be here. And that is probably the biggest mistake I would say I've ever made, realistically. I think that partially that was fear that she wasn't going to be here and I wasn't ready to say goodbye. And partially I think it was hope. And yeah, I think it was a combination of fear and hope that really chose me to, because prior to that, I'd always had like a big goodbye, and it was always like, not a big goodbye, but I'd always made a point to say goodbye to her when I went back to school, you know, to go out of my way. And I still like went and I saw her and I said goodbye, but I didn't really say goodbye. Like it was like a see you soon, I'll see you in a couple months. Like, you know, like you're saying bye to a friend. Like it wasn't, you know, and previously it was always, okay, like hugs, kisses, I love you, I'll see you when I see you. Like, but I think at that point, a part of me knew what was coming and I wasn't ready to say goodbye. And that was a interesting realization for me because I knew it was coming and I thought I was ready and I wasn't. I was not at all ready. When I got the phone call, I was just kind of paralyzed for 2 weeks, really. I didn't really feel anything for 2 weeks. I don't remember what those 2 weeks were like. And then 2 weeks later, you know, I was in a show at the time, and then 2 weeks later, everything just kind of, the semester picked up, and then I was coming out as an AK, and the funeral was before I came out, and that was the worst part, I can tell you. The worst part was going to the funeral, knowing that my AKA process was almost over and I couldn't honor her the way I wanted to with my letters, because at that point in time, nobody knew that I was about to come out as an AK, and just not being able to sing for her, not being able to, you know, participate in certain things really got to me, because I was like, I'm a part of this too. And I think she wanted to see all of us cross over. My grandmother's an AK, I'm a legacy, my cousins and aunt, they're all AKs, and I think she really wanted me to see me cross over. And a part of me will always believe that she hung on for so long to see me cross over and that she just couldn't hold on anymore. And I will forever believe that, because she knew, though she didn't know, I think beyond the flesh, she knew. And that, I think she really wanted to hold on for my probate and really wanted to be there. Because I remember having conversations with her that when I talked about probate, when I talked about AK, she knew exactly what I was talking about. Like I could hold full conversations with her, even if she wasn't remembering, you know, other things. When it came to AK, she knew exactly what I was talking about. And I think that, that what I would say, in my opinion, was the hardest part of my grief, was crossing. And I promise not every episode's going to be about AK, and but in this episode, my grandmother is a big portion of the reason that I crossed AK. So I think it is important to acknowledge that. But as I was saying, that will be the hardest thing for me forever. Like I will never be able to celebrate my Akiversary without, you know, knowing that I was so close to my grandmother seeing all of her grandchildren cross over, and I just barely missed it. And I think the grief didn't come until after probate. I cried the day of, I cried at the funeral. Let me take that back. A lot of the grief set in at the funeral, or prior to, or the days leading up to the funeral. I left school to go to the funeral. I flew to Mississippi, and my family and I went to the funeral, and I was very strong that I would not sing at my grandmother's funeral. Everyone's like, it's your grandmother, you need to sing. I swore I would not sing at my grandmother's funeral. My grandmother was a singer. That's where I get a lot of my voice from. But I would not sing at my grandmother's funeral. And I think, again, it was partially that I wasn't ready to say goodbye. And even like at the viewing and prior to the casket being closed, the one thing I never said was goodbye. That is, I think, I think I said everything else but goodbye at that point in time. I was not ready, ever. And I don't think that's something I would have ever been ready for. I think like as a kid growing up, like, you know, grandma's house is the best place to be. There's always like, you know, things you can do at grandma's house that you can't do at mom and dad's house. And, you know, there's, you know, you get all the fun snacks and see all the fun people who give you gifts and cakes and presents. And that's how my childhood was. So I wasn't ready to say goodbye to this image of my childhood. And especially because I had already been dealing with growing up and that kind of grief. So I would say saying goodbyes was just not something I could do. And I think if it were to happen like now, that wouldn't change. So I think that a lot of my response to grief was not acceptance. Some people respond to grief and they're like, yes, I knew it was coming. A lot of my response was denial. To this day, I would say is denial. Like, it really hasn't set in for me that my grandmother is dead at all. There are some days that I'm like, this isn't real. This isn't real life. She's on vacation. I'll see her in a couple months, which is such a scary thought because I know eventually it is going to set in. And when it does, who knows? That's one of the things that's really up in the air of, you know, what that will be. And I think I wouldn't describe the grief as painful. I'm sad and I miss her, but I think I have the most peaceful grief in her death because she was such a good woman. She was such a good woman and she was such a impact in my life and someone who was constantly around and just such a pure soul that I learned from. Just learned in like such a God-fearing woman. And I learned so much from her in the time that I spent with her that none of the grief is sad grief. So I think that's the best part. It's not angry grief. It's not sad grief. And some people have angry grief. I'm going to get into some angry grief in a little bit. And some people have sad grief. But I think peaceful grief in my opinion would be the type of grief where you know that the thing you're letting go of is going to the place it needs to. And I know that my grandmother went home. And I know that she's so happy. And I know that she smiles on us. We have a wind chime outside my house that was gifted to us that has her favorite Bible verse on it. And if you know me personally, you know that I have her favorite Bible verse tattooed on my back. And that wind chime rings every time that I think she wants her presence to be known in my house. And it's actually ringing right now. I had to close my door before I started recording. But that for me reminds me that she's not in pain anymore. She's not hurting anymore. She's not, you know, struggling to remember who I was, which I know hurt her. Like struggling to remember who we were, struggling to remember who I was. I know definitely hurt her. And she's not going through that anymore. And I know she's in a peaceful place, which brings me peace. As sad as I am to have lost someone so close to me and someone who I loved so much, and it's a battle every single day to continue, which I'm going to talk about in a second, she's at peace. And that I'm so grateful for. And I'm so grateful that like I serve a God that's even an option, that, you know, there is no afterlife. There is no doing it again. There's just peace and eternal life. So, now on, it is a struggle to get up every day. Like I said, the first 2 weeks, gone. Couldn't tell you anything I did during those 2 weeks. I could not tell you. I was just going through the motions. Like I felt like I was watching my body function. Genuinely. Because like every night I'd lay in bed and I'd be like, just remembering every single memory I had with her and forcing myself to remember her voice, because when my fear was forgetting, and if I were to forget, that was all I had left. If you know me, momentums are a huge thing to me. Now, especially my grandmother's momentums are a huge thing to me. If you ever see me, I will always have something of hers. Always, always, always will. have something of hers on my body at all times, always, no matter what. Like, there's nothing you could do that would make me take it off. And usually it's my AK necklace, and it's getting fixed right now. So, but those are the things that I think keep me connected to her. And, you know, some people will be like, those are just physical things. That's not your grandmother. But for me, she breathes life into me through those things. Breathes so much life into me through those things. So those things are important to me. We have a whole table, this table right here, in my house dedicated to her memory. Like almost a memorial in my house dedicated to her memory, of pictures of her. Like, these are flowers that we got her for Mother's Day. Like, that is also a part of the grief, because I think there was no way we could just say goodbye and then move on, life as normal. Everything changes when you lose something. Whether it be a person, a thing, a relationship, everything changes. I'm gonna let that simmer for a second. Everything changes when you lose something. My life is not the same as it was before February 6th, now that I've lost my grandmother. And I know that sounds irrational, but nothing in my life is the same. My family doesn't function the same. And that's not a negative thing. We function in a way of everything is in consideration of her right now, because we're all grieving. Mother's Day was a memorial of my grandmother. My first Mother's Day without her the whole day was empty for me, because I used to spend Mother's Day, it was constantly a celebration of my grandmother. So when that changed, Mother's Day felt very empty for me. I celebrated my mom in the best way that I could, because you guys know, if you know my mom's one of the greatest people you'll ever meet. Like, sweetest, greatest, most loving, most charismatic people you will ever meet. If you get the chance to meet my mom, I think you should. Like, any of you get the chance to meet my mom, you should. Like, my mom is one of the greatest people ever. But it was so hard and so draining, because that day was so different. Like, that was my grandmother's day. We always celebrated Mother's Day for her. She was the elder of our family. And the first time without that would just kind of felt like a memorial of something unreal, like that didn't actually happen. And so that was hard. And everything changes. Going back to school is not the same, because I don't have to go say goodbye to her now, you know, and my birthday's not the same, because she used to call me every birthday and be like, hey, Christiana, this is your grandmother. I just wanted to wish you a happy birthday. Always was the first person to wish me a happy birthday. Shows, she was always the first person there, and was always like, that was so good. Even if I was tree number 4, would always tell me how good the show was and how proud she was of me. And would always celebrate everything that I did. And I know she would be so proud of the way I wear my letters, and just like the service that I'm doing right now. And that's hard, because I always looked for the validation from her, because I knew she'd be proud of me. And it wasn't seeking validation because I needed to be validated. It was because that was the one person who I knew was always going to be proud, no matter what. And that changes. There's a shift. Loss creates a shift in every aspect. So yeah, so that's peaceful grief for me. That's what that's like right now. That'll change. You know, my grief is not going to be the same in 6 months. Time heals wounds. I do think this is a wound that time won't stitch back up completely, but time does heal wounds. So in 6 months, you know, I may look back on this and not feel like that anymore. I may not have peaceful grief, but for right now, in terms of grief and death, my grief is peaceful. My grief is very peaceful. So I want to get into another type of grief, relational grief. I got out of a relationship a little bit ago. Not a long time ago, recently. I got out of a relationship, and I know what you guys are thinking, geez, like her life just kind of fell apart recently, but yeah, I got out of a relationship a little bit ago, and this person I had been with for some time. We've been together for a really long time. And it was interesting because I'd never left a relationship like this. I ended the relationship, which that is the first time that I ended it. And I ended it for reasons of, we are both in our 20s and we both started to want different things for ourselves. And that took a toll on our relationship. And as much as we were fighting for what we had, it got to the point where I couldn't anymore, because you could clearly see how different our futures were, and they just didn't align, and I didn't want to force it. That is my version of angry grief. Very angry grief. Not angry, just frustrating, I think. But it's frustrating not at the person, more at the situation. I feel like so much time was put into this relationship for it just to fall apart. And that was a really hard thing for me to accept, because for so long, I was like, I've done it. I figured it out. Like, I've done the thing. You know, you're young and you're like, yep, I've met the, person I'm going to be with. This is that. And then it's not that. And that is, I grieve so much out of that relationship. And I think that it's important to acknowledge that. I don't think it hurts to acknowledge that kind of grief. I think a lot was lost in that relationship. I think I wouldn't say time was wasted, but time was lost. Especially the last year or so, I would say time was lost. And that's nobody's fault, I don't think. And I also think that a lot of feelings get grieved when you lose a relationship. Especially initially, when you lose the relationship, you miss the initial feeling back, however long ago when the relationship started. You miss what that was like, what being young and the first date, or being young and, the first time you say I love you, all of your exciting moments. I think that is the thing you grieve. I personally grieved the most when it ended, because those were the things that got me through when I started to notice that the relationship was falling apart. And I also think that you have to decide if, when you're grieving the person or the feeling. It's okay to absolutely grieve both. But I think, like, when you're grieving a relationship, you have to decide, especially relationships end for all kinds of reasons, but you grieve them regardless. I'm a heavy believer that, especially in my situation, just because I ended the relationship, I still have every right to grieve it. Because some people believe, oh, well, you ended it. If you, didn't want to be sad about it, you shouldn't have ended it. I'm a strong believer that I can still grieve something that I didn't want to be a part of anymore. I can absolutely, because it was very, very hard for me to end that relationship. Very hard. And I think it's hard for anyone to end something that so much time and energy has been put into. Absolutely. And I think that also comes in with grieving the feeling, grieving the person, and grieving the activities. There are things that, when you're dating someone, become your things. And there are things now that I will not be able to participate in without thinking about him. No doubt. No doubt. But that's okay. And I call it angry grief because it's more angry grief at myself. Because, let me say this, it's more of an insecurity grief, because there are days where I'm like, I just couldn't get it right. No matter how hard I tried, I just couldn't get it right. I just couldn't. To save my life. Like, I couldn't do it. And it got to the point where like the day of, I was like, I can't get this. I can't do this. And if you know me, I'm a perfectionist. So when things start to fall apart and I can't do them, I get frustrated. And that day I was like, I can't do it. I literally cannot figure this out. And so I had to let it go. Is it something that I probably should have let go sooner? Yes. Yes. Because I knew, and the person I was with knew, that our futures were just different. That didn't change the love, that didn't change anything. Our futures were just so different. And we really, really wanted to be, despite the odds, but we couldn't. And that's where the grief came in. It was like, dang, I thought we could do it. Like I thought we were gonna figure it out, but we just couldn't. For a lot of reasons. You know, our relationship is different, and I'm not gonna go into any of the logistics of our relationship, but it was hard because I realized that at almost 21, everything's changing because I've lost somebody now. Everything is different. My life is different. You know, my day-to-day routine is different now. And that was grief. That was something I lost. And with loss comes gain, but you don't feel it right away. You don't feel it right away. In the moment, it's like everything is gone. And I would say the time period between losing my grandmother and losing my relationship were about 2 months. About a month. Let's call it a month. And I was like, okay, everything just changed once. Now it's changing again. Whoa. When I tell you that your 20s are a time of grief and change, absolutely. And I'm literally only 3 months in. Everything has changed. Every month since my birthday, and prior to my birthday, everything has changed. Everything. 100%. And losing the relationship was a really, really hard thing for me because I had been in this routine, for, my book almost fell, for a long time. Longer than the average 20-year-old. Altogether. A long time. So when that changed, I was like, I don't even know how to function. Because before the relationship, I was 16. Now I'm almost 21. How do I even function? How do I go back into the dating world? Where do I even start? And I think that's where my grief came in, to be transparent. Where do I even start on starting my life again? How do I start my life again? Who's gonna think I'm pretty with all these wounds? Who's gonna want to talk to somebody like me? Are they gonna look at me the way that he did? Did he even look at me like that, or was it just time? What's it gonna be like to be in love again? All of these questions race through my head, and I feel like we're very much attached to my grief. There was a time period, I would say I grieved the relationship a little quicker than I typically would. If you know me, I'm very emotional, because I saw that it was coming. I saw that we just were not working because of what we were both doing for ourselves. So I knew, and I had been preparing myself for it, but as soon as it happened, the grief rushed through me. As soon as it happened. And then I was filled with all these questions like, hold on, I didn't think about this. I have to start my life over. So I would say that kind of grief I've definitely been through before. Definitely, like, this is not my first breakup, but it was weird because I was scared. It was insecurity and fear. Grief surrounded by insecurity and fear. And a lot of Christians believe God did not fill us with the spirit of fear, but we are human, 100%. And so I was so scared of, sorry, my dog was asleep next to me, so I didn't want him snoring in the pod, but I was 100% scared of what's next. What do I do now that I'm sad and alone? That's so constant. What do I do now that I'm sad and alone? I'm gonna leave that one right there. We'll circle back to that. But the next type of grief I want to talk about is childhood grief. If you're like I was, you went through COVID, you turned 16, 17, 18 through the years of COVID. And it was a lot of goodbyes. I am very blessed. I did not lose anybody to COVID personally, but COVID was when I had to realize my childhood was over. COVID was when I realized, okay, I need to learn how to drive a car. I need to learn how to pay my bills. I need to get a credit card. I need to start paying my phone bill. I'm going to college soon. I have to apply to colleges. Okay, now I'm at college. I need to start paying more bills. I need to help with tuition. COVID was when I realized I couldn't be a baby anymore. I'm an only child, so my parents spoil me rotten. And COVID was like, when I realized, I was like, whoa, I have to be an adult now. And I wasn't even 18 yet. And I was like, adulthood is coming very fast. So I think the hardest thing about grieving your childhood is remembering. Remembering that, you know, I can't wake up at 11 o'clock and there's going to be pancakes on the stove anymore. You know, I wake up and I make myself pancakes because, you know, my parents both work full-time jobs. I work a full-time job now. And I think that's the hard part, is that your childhood is sadly, one moment, over. You're growing up and it's time we move on. So I think that's the scariest part for me. The scariest part for me was definitely high school graduation. Saying goodbye to my child. Out of all of the things in my childhood, graduating was my real, like, okay, it's time. And that's hard. Apologies, I'm gonna pick up right where I left off. Yeah, I think saying goodbye to my childhood, high school graduation was the hardest part of that. I was the only person in my friend group going out of state. And I was pursuing a dream. I really was. At that time, I was pursuing this big dream. And as I was doing that, I literally felt my childhood slowly slipping through my fingers. Like, as I went to college my first year, stuff started happening to me. And if you know anything about my first year of college, it was a smack in the face that I wasn't a child anymore. If you know any, and we will get into like the college pod, that was, whoa, that was something else. My first year of college was crazy. We'll talk about that one day soon. It really was like, hey, you're not a kid anymore. Grow up. And that's when I felt like I started pushing things away that were my dog is sitting next to me and he's like walking around on the couch. So I'm just, okay. Excuse me. I started throwing things out of my life that reminded me of my childhood. And I came home one break and my mom was like, are you okay? Like, you know, you don't seem like you're enjoying college. And I was like, I miss being a kid. And that's when she was like, you don't have to throw away being a child because you're an adult. And there's this whole thing that was trending about healing your inner child. And I think it's so important to acknowledge that healing your inner child growing up does not mean hurting your inner child. There are so many things that I do in my daily life to avoid grief of my inner child because I don't feel like she needs to die. That is unnecessary grief, I feel like. Grieving your childhood and your inner child, I don't think is necessary. Because why? When I can be an adult and still heal my child. In my adult life, there are so many things that hanging out with my parents on a regular basis, making sure at night I spend at least 2 hours with my parents, just watching a movie, laughing, strolling in the middle of the living room with my dad, like walking my dog, going to the park, making dinner, telling them about what's going on in my life heals my inner child. Because as a kid, I would not shut up. As a child, I would not shut up. And so I used to talk to them about everything. Literally every little thing I talked to my parents about. So that heals my child. That heals my inner child, absolutely. I think it's important to tend to that grief and acknowledge that that grief is there for everybody, every single person. I don't think I know anyone who did not go through a period of feeling like they lost their childhood. Unfortunately for me, I let mine go until recently. I was like, what happens to everyone? Everyone grieves it, you have to let it go. That's not the case. That's not real. You don't have to let it go. You can live your life and still, heal your child. So that is important. Your childhood, COVID took a lot of our childhoods. For me, I wasn't a COVID baby, but at my job, I see a lot of COVID babies, and COVID took their childhood. They don't play outside. They don't, they just don't. There's a lot of things that I partook in as a child that they just don't at all. So I would say that kind of grief is something that doesn't really hit you. I think it hits you before your 20s. I think 17, 18 is when I really started to feel the grief of my childhood really set in, that I'm not a baby anymore. I'm not even a kid anymore. Like, I'm a young adult now. And even every now and then when I'm home, I'll drive past my high school and be like, dang, I really miss that. But I also think that it is very crucial to growing up, acknowledging that grief, acknowledging that I miss jumping on my trampoline. I miss making smoothies with my mom on Fridays. I miss going to sleepovers. I miss sleepaway camp. Acknowledging that is so, so, so crucial. So crucial. Because if you act like you don't miss it, then it's gonna hurt more when it hits you that it's really gone. If you act like you do not miss something, it is going to hit you a whole lot more when your brain and your heart connect and you acknowledge that it's actually gone. That's something I realized with my grandmother passing, losing my relationship with my childhood, every form of grief. I realized that there's no way I can acknowledge that I don't miss it and still tend to the grief properly, ultimately. So, in closing, I know that was a lot of grief talk. I think the biggest thing for me was I wanted to share what grief was like for me. I know we did not talk about, how to heal grief, how to touch grief, all these things about grief, but I shared my grief and we talked the importance of different things tending to grief and acknowledging certain griefs. And we didn't hit all the points I wanted to, but I really felt like God tugging at me to just share that maybe somebody needs to hear my story, to just share. So in closing, it is okay that you are grieving. If you're grieving right now, it's okay. I'm grieving right now, a lot of things. Be present in your grief. Be loving to your grief, tend to your grief, care for your grief. Let it love you. Let your grief love you. So I'm gonna pray us out. I think I talked super, super fast and went through a lot, but replay this if you need to and touch on the pieces you need. So I'm going to pray us out really quickly. Gracious and Heavenly Father, God, I thank you for today, and I thank you for gathering me and all these people together, Lord. God, I pray that you just allow us to be one with our grief, God. God, allow our grief not to overtake us. Allow our grief not to consume us. Allow us to love our grief and care for it in the way in which it needs to be cared for, Lord. Lord, I just pray that we are always present with you, and we allow you to take us through our grief and navigate it and heal us in the way in which you see fit, Lord God. I say all of this in your wonderful, miraculous name. Amen. Thank you for joining me. I will see you guys next week on the Transparent Podcast.